I don't mind sharing. I'm a little worried that sharing my screen and joining two meetings is going to be too much to handle.
One sec. Oops. How's that look? All right, looks like John, you're at the top of the agenda there.
Yeah, I think this was, I forget, I've had so many like small meetings. I don't think we've talked about the recent multi-network stuff. But basically, yeah, the multi-network is probably the best doc, but I think we're only sharing one tab. Basically, we kind of came up, for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about like, okay, what are we going to put in SNI? What's the format? How are we going to use that to route in multi-network? And I think I couldn't find a way to make all the pieces connect, so I kind of stepped back and thought through kind of a different way to do things. And the TLDR, I forget if I put a picture eventually, but is that for traffic? Oh, I did. Perfect. For traffic through East-West Gateway, we will actually just do 2 layers of H-bone tunnel. And so the inner tunnel looks exactly like if we were requesting the destination directly. So we're going to use the application's client cert. We're going to validate the server pod certificate. We're going to set the pod IP in the authority header. That's all completely normal. But then we take that as is and wrap it in an additional layer of H-bone only when we're going to the East-West Gateway. And in there, we will put the destination that we want in the authority header. And for the client and server cert validation, we'll actually use the tunnels cert and the East-West Gateway cert directly instead of doing any weird spoofing type thing. That's both simpler and it allows a lot of connection reuse. So we can probably have one connection between each Z tunnel and the East-West Gateway and multiplex everything on that. This is actually a bit confusing, my diagram, because I put the TLS info next to the H-bone info. But that's actually not right. The connection is separate from H-bone. So there's multiple H-bone streams about one TLS. So I should probably update the diagram. That's kind of the basic idea. So you'll notice there's no SNI used here, so we don't have to worry about kind of mangling, to try and get the info we want in SNI or coming up with a new format or doing all these kind of weird things. We just do normal routing on H-bone. And that's pretty much the summary. I go into details on how precisely it will work. I forget the details at this point, but I can go through them or people can ask questions, whatever we want to do. The cool part about this proposal is that we don't actually have to do anything right now because the protocol is completely unchanged. This is all just additive. So unless someone really cares about doing multi-network as soon as possible, like I would just not even touch this doc for 6 months. And then once we ship alpha or beta, come back to it and start working on it. Whereas some of the other proposals were kind of like rewriting the entire protocol and everything, which needed changes immediately.
John, can you outline how this differs from what we do today?
Yep. So what we do today would be if we just, obviously we don't do H-bone, but if we just had, and we just send a normal MTLS stream, but then we send it to the East-West Gateway. Now that MTLS stream has an SNI format that is kind of this weird, if you've seen it, it's like the dot underscore thing. It has the service name and the subset and the port. And then we like unmangle that, convert it to a cluster and forward it as is. So there's a few issues with that. One is that the SNI format's like totally bizarre and it leaks beyond just multi-network. Like we need to understand it at all points, in Z tunnel and Envoy and sidecars. And we really want to make H-bone kind of not have these kind of funky Eastio-isms in there. Another issue is that we don't actually do any validation at all in the East-West Gateway. So we're kind of opening up this endpoint on the potentially public internet, and saying, okay, any request can come through. We're not going to validate, with TLS, and we're just going to pass it into our network. So while, network perimeter is are seen as kind of weak in zero trust and something you shouldn't rely on, it doesn't mean that it should just be opened up entirely to the public internet, right? So with this model, we actually terminate a layer of MTLS and validate that it's from a valid Z-tunnel. So you at least need to be in the mesh to even get into the other network. And then, of course, the next request will go through to the actual client, which will do their own validation of the actual peer-to-peer and can apply authorization policies and whatnot.
And I haven't looked down later in the doc. Do we evaluate like the computational cost of the double encryption?
We speculate, and Etan said that he was going to test it.
Cool.
So the speculation is that it will be fairly low. That handshake is going to be amortized because we'll share a connection between Z-tunnel and East-West Gateway. So we'll have one or a handful. The CPU cost, that's kind of, I think, the biggest open question. I don't think it's going to be that high, but we'll see once we get the real numbers.
Thanks.
So John, can you guys hear me okay?
I hear you, Lynn.
All right, Google Meet actually works today for me. So quick question, is it possible if the performance test is not going to be very favorable? I know you mentioned, I think you said ATA, not Ethan, is that right? It's going to do some tests.
I could be.
Okay, yeah, so if the performance is not very favorable, then would it be possible still allow user to go back to use pass-through with this design?
Not really, because then we have to go put everything in SNI, which changes the whole protocol and trickles down to all parts of the project. I mean, yes, we could go do that again, but it's not just something, a new feature on top. We have to kind of change everything.
Okay, but okay, maybe this is a naive question. So if you go back to the diagram you have, right? If the authority header on the inner edge bone, it has the pod IP and potential, maybe the host name we discussed.
Oh, yeah.
And also the subset information, then wouldn't we have that information for all
but you have to terminate the TLS in order to see that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got you. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. Yeah. Now I understand why I couldn't.
So, I mean, we should find, I think we should find out whether the performance numbers shortly and make decisions, and not 8 months from now and then realize, oops, this was a bad idea. I do know that this has precedent of doing this exact thing of double layers of HTTPS tunnels. I haven't seen their performance numbers, but this is the people like Google and Apple and whatnot doing this. So I assume they've done this more thoroughly, and we'll get the real numbers as well and see. One other note as well is generally the network is also really expensive anyways. So if we're adding a small overhead on top of that, it may be kind of minuscule compared to the cost of the full network traversal.
Especially given that this network traversal is more it's usually it's not within cluster. That's the point. Yeah.
So I have a naive question. I can see here that the internal cert is the client pod, which of course the Z-tunnel for that node is able to retrieve because it can show that it runs a particular pod. What is the Z-tunnel client cert?
So when the Z-tunnel opens up a connection to the East-West Gateway and needs to present some certificate, and so in that case, it will present one with its own identity. So that's something we don't actually use today. I don't even know if we fetch a certificate for it. We only fetch them for the actual workloads, right? But we'll start fetching that certificate and then use that one. So the reason is we don't need to say that this is like the HTTP bin client talking, because that's on the inner layer, right? And by using the the Z-tunnel one, we can multiplex more. We could use the same client one on both. It just doesn't really provide benefit, and it does add cost of having to have multiple connections.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, because you check the source and target, have if they have the same identity. Yeah, so using Z-tunnel, at least all the pods on the co-located on the same node, they can pre-assume using the same tunnel, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
So-
that's a great question, Mitch, by the way.
Thanks. I'm trying. I think I understand what this looks like over the wire. What does it look like from an orchestration standpoint? Is the east-west gateway still an Envoy, similar to other gateways, or is it implemented 100% in the Z-tunnel? If so, is it a particular instance of the Z-tunnel, or can any node's Z-tunnel act as an east-west gateway for multi-cluster traffic?
Yeah, so I think it could be a Z-tunnel, but given that we are probably going to need to support backwards compatibility for the old way with sidecars and whatnot, my proposal is that we do it in Envoy at first. Maybe down the road, if we don't care about that case anymore and we find that it's much simpler in Z-tunnel, then sure, we can go do it in Z-tunnel. But I think most of the benefits are kind of lost. Envoy can pipe a TCP stream pretty quickly. It may be the config isn't as efficient, but it's also you're only running a handful of these, right? It's not like you're running them on every pod. So I think we just start with Envoy, but it could be Z-tunnel, certainly.
Thanks.
Also, with this proposal, the Z-tunnel client, I guess it could potentially be a east-west gateway also, right? So if the organization wants to control all the outbound traffic through a east-west gateway, so that's possible. And I think we discussed that it could potentially be a waypoint as well. Actually, it may not be a waypoint, because if we only support destination only waypoint, right? Maybe it wouldn't be a waypoint. I'm just thinking loud about the edge-bone outer that client certs.
I'm not sure that I follow you. Sorry.
Yeah, so basically I'm trying to say the edge-bone outer, right, the one you have in yellow in this diagram, that
Yeah.
client cert could be a egress gateway cert.
Well,
Right,
just whoever's the thing that's opening up a connection to the east-west gateway should present their own certificate.
Yeah, which could be Z-tunnel, and which also could be egress gateway, which could also be sidecar, I assume.
Yep, that could be anyone.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if it could be a waypoint, given we get rid of client-side waypoint proxy.
I forget. I think it's discussed below. I think it can be a waypoint actually if you have a service that has a local waypoint, but then only remote pods, you may hit the waypoint on your local network and then forward it to the remote network. But there was an open discussion about what does it mean to, today we say, okay, I'm connecting to workload X, it has a waypoint, and therefore I should send to the waypoint. But we don't define what exactly it means to have a waypoint, right? Does that mean there's a waypoint in the mesh for that service account, in the cluster, in the network? That's something we haven't actually answered yet. So depending on the answer to that question would answer your question.
Okay, yeah, I see, yeah.
We may not consider a waypoint for foo that's in a different network as being for foo, right? If that makes sense. You may have to deploy it in each network or each cluster even. We'll have to decide that.
Mm-hmm.
So I have one question here. So this pod IP, here is a destination pod IP, right? So where is the load balancing happening for the destination port IP? I was thinking it should be waypoint on the destination side, right?
Yeah, so there's actually different cases. Sometimes we'll send the service IP, sometimes the pod IP, depending on the client and the destination and what capabilities they have. So if there's a waypoint on the other side, then we would likely send the service IP and the waypoint will handle that. If there's no waypoints on the path, we may just resolve it to a pod IP in the Z tunnel.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one more question: East-West gateway, it's gonna be the pass through, right? Still the same as what East-West gateway is.
It's not pass through. It terminates the outer layer and then passes through the inner layer. So I mean, it is kind of pass through, but it's not the same.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
John, is there more discussion you wanted to have on this proposal?
Not really, unless people have concerns. I mean, the main thing as well is like we can discuss like the minor details for the coming months because I don't think we plan to actually implement this, but the main thing is agreeing to not make protocol changes, basically, so that we don't have to do anything now and we can defer this to later. So yeah, thanks for sharing. I'd encourage people to take a closer look at the doc as well, think through it. I don't want to speak for all the people that aren't here, but I think there was some general agreement between some of the folks at Google who aren't here, at least directionally, which is I think what the most important part is. So.
Okay, so looking back at our agenda, John, you had another doc. Are you wanting to discuss that as well?
No, that one's basically killed by the multi-network one.
Okay.
So multi-network one says, if we do this, then we don't do the SNI one.
Awesome. Then I think next up is Kevin, Eitan, and Lynn.
Yeah, Kevin, do you want to present? Do we have Kevin actually?
Sure.
Oh,
Can you
good.
guys hear me this time?
Yes, we can. Works.
Is
I will
this not the
raise
same?
concern up front about this doc. It doesn't look like it's been put into our Istio drive. So that means that community members can't comment or make proposals. If we could get that moved, that would be ideal.
Okay, yeah, we need to figure out how to move that. Yeah, no worries.
Yep.
Lynn, just a human question for me. Is this not the similar doc we went over last week?
Yeah, but that was only with John.
So you wanted to do a rehash then? Is that?
Yes, this is for the community. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so if you got the screen share, then we can start with the background. The proposal here is a design for how we want to handle bringing functionality that kind of has existed in Istio already via service entries, adding to the service registry. In particular, the VIPs and the host names, and how we want to handle the DNS integration in Istio open source for Ambient. And so it's a rehash or recap for the community. There's some functionality in Istio today, classic sidecar, where in Istio proxy in the sidecar, there runs like a Golang DNS server, and some of the, if you add a new service entry and you add a new virtual host and VIP, that gets resolved or is resolvable by the DNS server that's in the sidecar. The result of this is that services in your mesh are aware of your service entries. And we want to bring this functionality back to Ambient. In terms of the requirements, the first thing that's worth calling out is that because of the original behavior is on the sidecar, it means that, and additionally, there's that export to API. So if Lynn, if you were to scroll up here.
Oops.
But But anyways, if we're familiar with the export to, that lets you select a list of namespaces that this service entry applies to. And again, the result of this is basically that the DNS server is kind of client aware. In theory, it's possible for you to have like a www.example.com resolve to different VIPs if they had different export to namespaces, because they'd be handled by the DNS servers in the sidecars. So it's just kind of an interesting design implication that affects kind of the scalability of if we wanted to bring this to a sidecarless Istio, how would that work? And so the proposal here is kind of to not make it client aware. In kind of polling, use cases that we've seen in open source, there aren't a lot of good reasons that we've seen to have the same virtual host apply differently as like resolve to different VIPs. So basically the proposal here is to resolve scalability concerns is to have a single DNS server that lives kind of separate or as a sidecar to zTunnel. We can go over the options, but the one thing that they all have in common is that they are not client aware. Like a single virtual host will resolve to a single VIP, kind of across the mesh. And so the logistics of how we do that, I guess we can go to some of the pictures. We scroll down, Lynn. So option one here is to have Istio DNS, like basically that sidecar that are in the sidecar today. There's that Istio DNS server. So the baked into the proposal here is that we're gonna like rip that out and either make its own standalone, rebuild it, change it to another, build it into zTunnel or something else. But integrate with an external DNS and add our hosts to that DNS server. But the idea here is that in this scenario, let's pretend that Istio DNS is a daemon set. And so the client locally can resolve to that DNS server any hosts and then only send VIPs to zTunnel. And so zTunnel then just forwards things as usual, because we'll tell that, IstioT will tell you what that VIP resolves to as backing IPs. And another option is to instead go ahead and do this from, if we would scroll down to option 2. I guess worth calling out for option 1 is that this is all node local. There's nothing over the network. The Istio DNS server here, we want to be, we don't want to have to worry about DNSSEC or encryption or anything like that. So it's all node local, communicating plain text.
So when you say node local, that means this would be running as a daemon set?
Or potentially as a sidecar to zTunnel, which is more similar to how it works today. I think in an ideal final state, it would probably be built into zTunnel itself, like that server. I think John had pointed this out before, but the existing DNS functionality is sort of experimental. And so that kind of gives us some play here. Like maybe it would be okay to ship Ambient with it as a sidecar and then, later down the road, build it into zTunnel itself. Which would probably be ideal.
So I have a naive question about option 1. If we're already essentially running adjacent to the zTunnel, and the zTunnel is client aware, why can the DNS server not be client aware, similar to what it is with the sidecar model today?
So technically we could make it client aware. But if we did that, the memory config for Istio DNS would potentially, it could go as big as it could in today's implementation. It wouldn't scale per pod. Each node, so you need a map. You would need a map of like the namespace that you're in to all of the VIP map like host resolves. And so before that gets amortized, because each sidecar gets one entry in that map. Whereas now Istio DNS would have to have like a key for each namespace and then a duplicated map. So it would just be more memory, but we could do it. It just would mimic the memory profile of sidecar more closely, which we kind of wanted to get away from. Okay. But technically we could do it. So the proposal was to not do that. And then if we got pushed to it, maybe we go that route, but it didn't seem like something users were actually taking advantage of.
I see. Thank you.
And so the second proposal is kind of to do something, this is very similar to the first one if we rewrite it as a sidecar. The original idea proposal was to have Istio DNS potentially live separate, right? Like if it weren't client aware, it would have a very low CPU memory profile, and we could just hit it remotely and then cache DNS results. And then you wouldn't need like a ton of sidecars. You could just have one remote pod. But if we did this, then we would probably need to do DNSSEC or something like that. It would introduce, a lot of network concerns that it might just be worth it for the simplicity to build it into zTunnel as like a sidecar. So I'm kind of in favor of the sidecar approach rather than this, but I just want to call it this as an option rather than we could have just one state deployment or pod living remote and then talk to it.
So it looks like to me like the difference between these two diagrams is not so much where Istio DNS runs, whether it's a sidecar or an independent pod, but rather how the traffic is routed from the client to Istio DNS, whether
Correct.
it goes through the zTunnel. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And similarly, there's a third option is kind of like an integration or extension point. Really, we just need the DNS server to be aware of what the service entries have configured. There's no reason we couldn't take some, third-party DNS server and then somehow integrate it with Istio so that, if you add a service entry, Istio knows what that service entry means, and then it tells your external DNS, like core DNS or something else, how that resolves. And so then clients could just talk to that, third party, whatever, the client is already using for their DNS server. So that's another third option, but that requires kind of integration or more of an extension point. It's something that I could see people doing, but in terms of just like installing bare Istio and having it work on everyone's platform, it feels more like we'd want to build it into the existing, open source project, and then let people optimize and customize with some sort of extension point. Yeah, and I think that covers the basic gist of the proposal here. Lynn, were you able to share this document publicly? There's certainly more text and thoughts here, but I don't want to bore everyone with the less relevant details, but I want people to review this.
Yeah, so the doc is publicly available for anybody. The challenging I'm trying to work through is move to our Google Drive so other people can comment on it. So I'll do that today. And looks like we have some questions. Levin has a question, and Ben also have a question, so we should get to them.
Yeah, I have a question about interaction with the core DNS and this. I know like in the pod, when they do DNS, it goes through a search path, right? Whatever in the resolve.com. How does it get to the Istio DNS? Did it go through the core DNS first? It couldn't resolve and then go to this Istio DNS?
So for the initial two proposals, it was more about how the client talks to the DNS server, right? And that's kind of the crux of the question. So if we take option 2, where zTunnel kind of proxies or has it as a sidecar, we'd use the same kind of redirection logic that we have today. So IB tables or eBPF would have a rule set up that captures port 53, and then that traffic would go to zTunnel, and then zTunnel would either on the sidecar or proxy, remote somewhere, which we might want to avoid for security issues. And I'm kind of pushing against, but it's an option. That's how the traffic could get there. If it were its own like daemon set, we could update the CNI such that it redirects traffic to that daemon set instead of zTunnel. But there's not a huge gain. And I think the sidecar makes a little more sense because that's similar to what classic Istio does today and what people are familiar with. You just know the traffic's going to zTunnel. With respect to core DNS, if it's like a remote integration, that would be more akin to whatever's in your resolve conf or whatever. Like we wouldn't be doing anything fancy in Istio to capture that DNS traffic. The idea of the integration would be that on like the core DNS or your external DNS server, that would have to integrate with Istio, and that's kind of a hand wavy like potential down the road option, but not really something I would push for in a completely open source work on any platform offering.
Yeah, because with the core DNS, if you can have core DNS have some kind of plugin, understand SDO, you don't really need complicated CNI, stack, anything. Everything can be controlled by this DNS. Will tell you to go to zTunnel. I would think that's probably a better solution, because otherwise you have to provision all the BPF rules, all these things redirect the traffic. Just my
John had a comment. I don't know if he wanted to actually speak up, but he said that it's not transparent if we don't capture it. You have to go do the integration and set that up yourself rather than just kind of install and things work.
Oh yeah, of course. If you have enhanced core DNS with the whatever the plugin that understands this SDO, then POS still just talking to the core DNS, follow this, and then suddenly get a different IP, which goes to zTunnel.
Okay, great. I think that answers your question, Ewan.
Yeah, that answers my question. Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin was mentioning that we wouldn't have to worry about DNSSEC with option 1, but like we would if we had a client app that already expected to use DNSSEC, right? Like, that's something that we don't necessarily have control over, correct? Like, we don't necessarily know if we're going to be getting DNSSEC traffic or DNS plain text traffic. We just would have to handle both, correct? In all cases, depending on what the client might expect. I don't know a huge amount about DNSSEC, but I assume that's how that works. So if I'm wrong about that, somebody please correct me.
Yeah, so I imagine to support full feature set, we would have to do something. I'm not, frankly, a DNSSEC whiz either, but I don't think that we do anything with that today and already. And I think it's about feature parity or near for new features.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about how it would work.
Okay, great. So we don't support DNSSEC for sidecar today, right? So that's not the short-term goal for Ambient.
How important do we think that's going to be to customers?
Do you have specific requirements, Nathan?
I don't. That's why I'm asking.
I imagine if things are node local, it won't be as important because we already make assumptions about plain text communication node local. So I'd be surprised if DNS was the straw that broke the camel's back.
I just, again, like I think like the main thing is like I don't want to get into, and I think Ethan wrote that. Like I don't want to get into a situation where we have to implement a bunch of. We don't have to implement. I don't want to get into a situation where we have to implement a full DNS server that supports everything in zTunnel proper. So like I think that's an argument for keeping that stuff separate because DNS servers are their own entirely complex beast. So like either we keep it all out of zTunnel, or we like get very clear about what subset of DNS we will not support in zTunnel. I think is like the only thing that really sticks in my head is something we need to worry about.
Yeah, particularly, one of our goals for zTunnel from an orchestration perspective is that it be very safe to upgrade. And the way that we accomplish that is by doing very, very little in the zTunnel, because of course the blast radius is huge, right? It's the entire network for your entire cluster. So I would worry that adding DNS, even as a sidecar to the zTunnel, would create additional opportunities for regressions when the zTunnel is upgraded. But then again, wherever you put a DNS server, it has to get upgraded, right? There's no, whether it's core DNS and the customers have to upgrade that separately or in the zTunnel. But we do need to consider the consequences for upgrade that this would have.
Keeping zTunnel is a very faultless proxy for DNS. Whether we do that via sidecar or whatever, I think makes a lot of sense versus implementing like a DNS stack in zTunnel. But I don't think anybody's necessarily proposing that yet, so that's maybe premature to talk about.
So something I think I missed from the earlier discussion. If we do a sidecar, implemented by whatever core DNS, whatever's serving DNS, how do we implement the isolation by namespace? since, you know, the node could be running pods from different namespaces?
So the proposal, the per namespace, you mean like the old export to behavior, or maybe I didn't understand?
Yeah, exactly. The export to behavior. So if yeah, like www.myapp.com, whatever, you know, only applies to namespace 1, but we've got pods from namespace 1 and namespace 2 on the same node. Would we have to have 2 instances of the DNS server and somehow route between them based on which client it's coming from or something like that? How would that work?
So the proposal here is to not do that because we did not see many use cases where that was something that was desirable, to have different host names and different VIPs. However, that doesn't preclude us from someday, you know, if there became really strong use cases supporting that, we just could update the Istio DNS server config rather than it just being like a simple map of host to like name table results or like the NDS. It could have the client namespace in the in-memory that Istio sends over. And then we'd have to figure out the mapping from the client namespace, you know, the client IP to the namespace. So I imagine there would be some kind of IP tables or eBPF, like we know who the source IP is, we can add some kind of packet mark, map that to a namespace, and then use that to do the right lookup. So
Yeah,
I don't think we could technically do it. I just don't think we'll ever be asked to.
So to make sure I understand, you're saying that we not implement the export to functionality for now? That if
Correct.
you define an alias, it's mesh wide.
That's correct.
That seems fair to me. Cool. Thanks for clarifying.
So what would that mean for the API during the time where users are making use of sidecars and ambient? The sidecars would honor export to and the ambient pods would not?
That's correct.
So it's worrisome to me to have a field in the API that we make available to users that we're not going to honor.
Perhaps we explicitly I think the default, I believe the default is global if you omit export to altogether.
It is global.
Right. So maybe we just only honor an ambient if export to is excluded. That way that there, you know, if there is an export to field on ambient, we just like warn or if there were statuses, we signal to the user somehow that that's not going to be picked up in ambient. And that also means if we ever get pushed in the future to add this functionality, we can without any API break.
Okay.
It could mean dual configuration if you want the same service entry for, well, if it's global and ambient, I don't know why you wouldn't want it global in general. So.
And I do think we're going to have export to changes, not just for this, right? Because if you look at waypoint proxy, there is no sidecar resource applied to waypoint proxy. The destination rule and virtual service today supports export to along with service entry, right? I'm not sure if a destination rule and service entry would support export to in ambient. I would argue no, because we don't need to, right? Because that waypoint is producer only, so there's no point for user to specify the export to scope. They could explicitly binding to a particular waypoint with specify export to. Eitan, what's your?
Oh, I was just going to raise that Ian Rudy in the chat made a very good point, that we can use the validating webhook here in the same way that we do for L4 that we're doing for the L4 policies.
So we can't make validating webhook changes between minor versions of Istio. That will block upgrades. Basically, you have a completely valid version of the API in one version, you upgrade and it becomes invalid. So we can warn on it, and we can write analysis messages to the status field, but failing validation is not an option there.
Because the non-global.
I'm sorry, can
You
you
mean
say
like if you had a non-global service entry and then transitioned to ambient, it would just implicitly stop working?
right? The validation decision needs to be made at object creation time. So to
Yeah.
make a different decision at upgrade time causes all kinds of problems for Kubernetes.
Actually, in that scenario, if you have export 2 on your service entry from sidecar word, right, and then you move to ambient while your export 2 is being ignored, it would continue to work. It's the only thing is your service entry potentially being seen by more pods than it's actually necessary in the sidecar word, right? So it actually would work just fine. So I'm not sure if we would want to reject. I think warning is probably makes sense in that scenario.
Lynn, you mentioned virtual service and destination rules export to functionality through the sidecar resource. My understanding is we're not supporting those in Ambient. We're requiring Gateway API. Is that right?
Right. So I'm just saying that it's consistent to the user, right? Export 2 is no longer being supported with ambient from service entry to virtual service and destination rule.
I see.
Not the virtual service and destination rule not supported. It's just the export 2 portion within the spec.
And I'm not super familiar with the Gamma initiative. Does anyone know? I don't see Keith or John here. Do we know if there's a similar functionality being considered for Gamma?
I don't believe so, at least not at the current designing phase.
So that by default, if I remember right, gateways are only accessible from the namespace they're created in, right? Because
Yeah.
the type of DNS that we have to take care of is the actual gateway host name, right?
Yeah, I think there are some discussion on this recently. I have to refresh my memory. I think you have to be either in your client or your server's namespace. You can't just export to a random namespace, which is what Istio supports at the moment.
Right.
Yeah, we have, in our implementation for the VPC ladders, using Gateway API, the gateway is only can be defined at the cluster level, and HTTP route is at the namespace level. And we do plan to have a DNS for the HTTP route, and that's we're going to use the Route 53 for
Okay.
HTTP route.
Once you define that route is accessible only from the namespace you defined it in?
Not necessary. So the way in our implementation is you can access to it, you can see it, but whether you can access to it is really defined by the IAM policy. So when you can define an IAM policy to see, as a service owner, you can define who can access you. And the client, every client will have a IAM policy attached to the client. So that's our implementation.
Thank you.
So I had some other meeting, and I'm obviously very interested in DNS in general. So I'm very excited, to see more integration with DNS. I'm just want to make sure that whatever you are doing can also be implemented with other, other DNS providers, and it's consistent with what other people are doing in both Kubernetes and outside Kubernetes. What are you using? How do you configure the suffix? I mean, the domain name. Do you let the user use arbitrary DNS suffix? I mean, example.com, or do you require a particular structure?
Oh, you mean in our implementation today?
Yes.
The current implementation is when you specify the host name under the HTTP route, that host name basically it will be an entry in the Route 53. So when the pod, when you say I want to do a DNS resolve of that host name, that DNS request will get resolved through the Route 53. We don't have a Gamma implementation yet. I could imagine in the future that can be a Gamma that's probably will resolve through the core DNS.
Sorry I'm a bit confused by Route 53. I assume you do validations that solo IO is owned by that particular owner, and I mean there are kind of access controls and issues with ownership of the domain, and then authorizations that particular route can create DNS entries, because that's.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So this is right now it's out of band. So it's after user have to outside the Kubernetes they create Route 53 entries, and during the creation you're going to check whether you own those things. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's perfect. I mean, for egress, I don't think there is any concern. I mean, that's considered kube external DNS and what other people are doing. That's fine. And you are not looking for the internal names, no, for the internal DNS and cluster.local and similar names.
Yeah, we still looking into that.
Okay.
Local. It just not yet. It just need more work. That's one of the things I was looking to option 3. Mention this document. Is it possible we can have open source community effort, have enhancement on core DNS, which understand can respond to, work for SDO, work for anything, everybody else. Yeah, that's my hope.
Yes, I had the same hope. I'm not entirely sure that it's very realistic given the time frames and everything else. Did you consider integration with, I think you also have a private DNS also, because, there is external DNS. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kubernetes external DNS project, but they have ability to synchronize private names to a private DNS zone.
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, that's the plan. We better on that external DNS plugin, understand the gateway API, and will automatically add the entry, the CNAME entries to the Route 53. That's I'm trying to verify, working on that this week and next week to see that works directly. On paper it should work. Yeah,
I'm sure it works. I saw code that is, but I only saw code with the public DNS. I mean, there is a public DNS and there is a private, the split horizon. In DNS servers, you can have the external one that is visible from outside, and you have a VPC only version of the DNS that is also available. That's the one I'm trying to find a solution for, and some common ground about how we structure the names.
I see. Got it. Okay.
I'll add comments on the document. I mean, I think on the external, I think everyone is pretty much doing the same things. There's no other way to do it practically. Okay. But for the internal one, I think we should sync up in particular on how we represent the namespace and cluster and disambiguate between different clusters.
Yeah, Costin, we should clarify. I think what Liwen is talking about is AWS's implementation. That's, as far as I can tell, that's not related to the document we're looking at here and the proposal.
Yeah.
For
Yeah, I put that in the chat, Costin. The conversation you were just having is related to the specific AWS implementation and not the design doc that Kevin was presenting.
Right. I mean, I assume it's an example. AWS, Google DNS. There are multiple vendors that will probably have DNS implementations that will expose this.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So Kevin, thanks for the doc. For my part, I would like to see something that has a little bit more of a global perspective on DNS and Ambient, not just for service entries, but also covering the the waypoint gateways and how those will interact with DNS as well. And then that export to decision becomes something that we can make consistent across the entire initiative, rather than making the decision again and again for service entries and then gateways, etc.
That makes sense. That's fair.
Yeah. And we have a parallel discussion about naming the pod. I mean, the host name, the proper host name of a pod, and how to represent it in SNI header. John had the document last time, and it will be perfect if it's aligned with the DNS. So if we decide on a DNS name for the pods, which is used as SNI, then we should probably have a corresponding DNS entry and the pod IP reflected in that automatically.
So Costin, I think that's related to the document we discussed in the first half. I'll share a link with you for you to take a look.
Sorry about it, yeah. I'll
That's
comment on the doc.
No, I want to make sure that you see it because your comments there are going to be important.
Okay.
I just dropped it into the chat there on the side. So we have 5 minutes left. Lynn, did you want to look at the next doc, the multi-cluster RFC, in those 5 minutes, or would you like to defer that to next week?
That's a great question. Ada, maybe we just defer because there's only a few minutes left. And in the meanwhile, I'll work on move the documents to the proper home so you guys can comment.
Sounds good. I'd be happy to help you move those if you run into any trouble. Just let me know.
Okay.
What I was going to say, Lynn, is if we want to just give like a high level, so, if people haven't thought about this and they want to, they can think about it. We don't have to like just go into detail. Just say like,
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's only 5. Yeah. Do you want to do that? Go ahead.
Sure. So essentially, the problem that we're aiming to solve here is that it's kind of an extension of the problem we were just talking about, DNS. And the reason that it's an extension is that Istio with sidecars essentially allows you to attach policies, specifically L7 policies, to host names that don't exist within the cluster itself, so non-Kubernetes host names. And this is something that we've seen to be a very popular feature. And so, this becomes a little more difficult in Ambient as there is no client-side Envoy proxy anymore. And with the recent decision to not have any client-side waypoints, that we have been thinking about how to apply L7 policy, meaning service entries, in this case, basically service entries and destination rules, to basically apply the destination rule policy to service entries in a way that can support non-Kubernetes host names or host names that don't exist on the same cluster. So yeah, basically kind of thinking through a generic way to apply to decide where the point at which that policy is enforced, given that there is no client-side sidecar and no client-side waypoint. So this doc kind of thinks through, the multi-cluster scenario or the egress scenario, and basically how do we accurately describe what the policy enforcement point is if there is no natural one. And so we posit that there should be a parent ref on these resources that essentially allows you to decide where that policy enforcement point is. But that's kind of the overarching issue, and we can dig further next time.
Cool. Thanks for the overview.
Yeah.
So if you haven't already, read up on this multi-cluster RFC and come ready to discuss it next week. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Submit your Istio Day talks. The deadline is Sunday.